Ford is famous for the Mustang and the F-150, but let's be real. This company has also unleashed some of the strangest cars the world has ever seen. From nuclear-powered dreams to hovercraft experiments, Ford sometimes built vehicles that looked more like props from a sci-fi movie than real transportation. So here's the question. What happens when an automaker throws out the rulebook entirely? Stick around, because the weirdest rides are just firing up. Ford Nucleon 1957. Picture this. You're cruising down Route 66 in the late 1950s, kids in the back seat, and instead of stopping for gas, you just swap out the nuclear reactor in your trunk. That was the mind-bending pitch behind the Ford Nucleon, maybe the most audacious concept car ever. Designed at the height of America's atomic obsession, this wasn't some half-baked doodle. It was a serious Ford project meant to explore the car of tomorrow. The Nucleon was built only as a scale model, but the idea was wild. A small, interchangeable nuclear reactor would power steam turbines, which in turn drove the wheels. Owners would pull into a service station, not for gasoline, but for a reactor swap, depending on how much range they wanted. Some proposals promised hundreds, even thousands of miles between refuels. It sounds absurd today, but remember, this was the age when people thought backyard nuclear power was around the corner. Stylistically, the car screamed jet age. It had a long, futuristic body, a forward cab to keep passengers as far away from the power module as possible, and huge tail fins. It wasn't just a car. It was a rolling billboard for the optimism and the naivete of atomic-era America. Of course, the reality check came fast. Nuclear technology never shrank to anything you could safely park in your garage. Radiation shielding would have weighed more than the car itself, and nobody really wanted to risk rear-ending a sedan with a reactor inside. The Nucleon never went beyond that model, but it became an icon of Cold War automotive imagination. Bold, ridiculous, and dangerous? Absolutely. But you can't deny it. Ford once imagined a world where soccer moms drove mini-nuclear subs on wheels. Ford Gyron, 1961. Now let's roll forward to 1961, when Ford decided that four wheels were too many. Enter the Gyron, a wedge-shaped two-wheeled car that looked like it belonged in a comic book. The pitch? A full-size automobile balanced upright by gyroscopes. Yes, Ford genuinely thought people might drive around in giant futuristic motorcycles with car bodies. The Gyron was designed by Alex Tremulous, the same stylist who had worked on the Tucker 48 and knew a thing or two about headline-grabbing design. His creation seated two passengers side by side, balanced by an internal gyroscope that, in theory, would keep the vehicle upright at any speed, even when stopped. On display, the Gyron actually needed hidden training wheels to stay balanced, but the EE concept was pure spectacle. The car's exterior looked like a spaceship. Sharp nose, sweeping tail, and a bubble canopy that made it feel like a jet fighter. Inside, it had aviation-inspired controls and wraparound seating. It wasn't just a car. It was a performance piece, meant to show how bold Ford could be in chasing sci-fi dreams. Unfortunately, the Gyron never moved beyond concept stage, and the only prototype was tragically destroyed in a 1962 fire at Ford's Rotunda Exhibition Center. But its legend lived on, not because it was practical, but because it represented pure imagination at a time when automakers weren't afraid to look insane. Think about it. A balancing two-wheeled car from one of the biggest names in Detroit. Was it safe? Probably not. Would people have lined up just to try it? Absolutely. The Gyron may have been impossible, but it's proof that Ford once leaned fully into science fiction territory and gave us a glimpse of what might have been if gravity itself was optional. Ford Levacar Mystere, 1959. Forget wheels for a second. In 1959, Ford's engineers asked a question that feels ripped straight from a sci-fi comic. Why not make a car float? The answer was the Levacar Mach 1, a single-seat hovercraft car that literally glided on a cushion of compressed air. That's right. Decades before, Back to the Future promised hoverboards, Ford was already testing a hover car. The Mach I was unveiled as part of Ford's dream car experiments, and it looked like a tiny spaceship. With a slick, bullet-shaped body and a canopy-style cockpit, the Levacar seemed like something NASA should have been testing on a runway, not Detroit. The system worked by pumping high-pressure air through nozzles, creating a lift effect similar to a hovercraft. The driver would steer using air jets, with no contact with the ground at all. Ford even demonstrated it on a test track. The prototype hovered while tethered to a guide rail. The problem? That tether was essential. Without it, controlling the hover car would have been nearly impossible. Imagine trying to drive in a crosswind while floating. Every little gust would throw you sideways. It wasn't exactly practical for a school run or a trip to the grocery store. Still, the Levacar wasn't just a gimmick. It showcased Ford's willingness to gamble on the wildest possible futures, even if those futures turned out to be dead ends. The hover concept resurfaced occasionally in other companies' prototypes, but like flying cars, it never broke out of science fair mode. Was the Levacar Mach Saw ridiculous? Sure. But it also symbolized pure optimism, a belief that transportation could break free of wheels and roads altogether. If nothing else, Ford proved that hover car wasn't just a dream headline. It was a real prototype you could touch, if you didn't mind it drifting off the rails. Ford Seattle-ite, 21-19-62. By the early 1960s, automakers weren't just selling cars, they were selling futures. And Ford's Seattle-ite 21 might be the most extravagant piece of future thinking ever wheeled into a convention hall. Revealed at the 1962 World's Fair in Seattle, this bizarre concept car wasn't even full scale. It was a 3/8 scale model, but it promised a future so radical, people could hardly believe it. Start with the wheels, not 4, not even 3. The Seattle-ite had 6 wheels, 2 at the back and 4 smaller ones at the front. Why? The front quartet was designed for ultra-precise steering, giving the car an agility regular sedans could never match. It looked more like a spacecraft than a car, with a long fuselage body and a sweeping glass canopy. But the real wild part was its modular design. Ford claimed the Seattle-ite would let you swap out entire front-end power modules depending on your driving needs. Want an economical commuter? Clip in a small power plant. Need cross-country power? Pop in a nuclear or turbine unit? In theory, the car could adapt to whatever technology the future delivered. Inside, things were even more futuristic. The Seattle-ite promised onboard computers, electronic navigation, and systems that could analyze road and traffic conditions. Basically, it was predicting GPS decades before satellites were guiding us down highways. Of course, none of it made it past the fantasy stage. But as a showpiece, the Seattle-ite was unforgettable. It summed up an era when car makers thought the 21st century meant atomic engines, space-age styling, and dashboards full of glowing electronics. Weird, completely. But it's also a reminder. The Seattle-ite wasn't about what worked, it was about what wowed. And in 1962, nothing wowed harder than a 6-wheeled, nuclear-ready, computer-driven car of tomorrow. Ford FX Atmos, 1954. Take a rocket ship, bolt on some fins, give it a dome canopy, and call it a car. That's basically what Ford did in 1954 with the FX Atmos. Introduced at the Chicago Auto Show, the FX Atmos was less family sedan and more Space Commander's shuttle. This was the atomic age in chrome form, and it showed just how far Ford was willing to chase science fiction. First off, the seating layout. The driver sat in the dead center of the car, flanked by two passengers on either side. Sound familiar? Years later, McLaren would use a similar layout in its legendary F1 supercar, but Ford tried it decades earlier. Above them, a clear bubble canopy offered panoramic views, which might have been thrilling if you ignored the fact that your head would roast under the sun. Then there was the steering. Forget the usual wheel. The FX Atmos used airplane-style hand grips, turning the whole driving experience into something more like piloting a fighter jet. Add in massive tail fins, stubby rocket-like exhausts, and you had a car that didn't so much roll onto the stage as launch. Brochures for the FX Atmos even hinted at atomic power sources. That was the fad of the day, Ford. Marketing liked to drop words like nuclear turbine, whether or not there was any chance of it working. In reality, the car had no running engine. It was a rolling model, pure theater meant to grab headlines. And grab them it did. The FX Atmos looked so outlandish that even hardened auto journalists called it closer to a spaceship than a road car. It was never built for production, but it wasn't supposed to be. It was meant to make jaws drop. So was it weird? No question. But in 1954, that weirdness was exactly the point. The FX Atmos wasn't a car. It was Ford showing the world just how far into the cosmos it was willing to imagine. Ford Mystere, 1955. If you wanted a car that looked like a spaceship but didn't actually work, Ford had you covered with the Mystere. Rolled out in 1955, the Mystere was one of those concept cars built purely to dazzle audiences, and boy, did it deliver. With its bubble canopy, oversized fins, and chrome-heavy body, it looked like the love child of a jet fighter and a jukebox. Here's the kicker. It had no engine. That's right, the Mystere wasn't drivable at all. It was essentially a movie prop, rolled on stage to make people think the future had already arrived. Ford designers claimed it was powered by a turbine engine, which sounded ultra-futuristic at the time. Turbines were the hot buzzword in the mid-1950s, promising jet-like speed in everyday cars. But in practice, they never took off for mass production. The Mystere also featured a unique trick, a throw-over steering wheel. In theory, this meant either front passenger could take the wheel. Imagine switching drivers without pulling over. It was bizarre, ambitious, and probably a nightmare for safety regulations. The cabin was equally space-age, with push-button controls and materials meant to look atomic modern. But the Mystere wasn't about practicality. It was about Ford flexing its design muscle in a world obsessed with rockets and nuclear dreams. It was part showpiece, part hype machine, and all spectacle. In the end, the Mystere never turned into a real production car. But that wasn't the point. It was a rolling fantasy meant to capture headlines, and in that regard, it worked perfectly. The weirdest part. People loved it, even though it couldn't move an inch under its own power. Ford X100, 1953. Before James Bond had his Aston Martin full of gadgets, Ford unveiled a car that was practically a rolling Swiss Army knife. The 1953 Ford X100 wasn't flashy with nuclear promises or jet styling. It was weird in a different way. This was a concept car crammed with over 50 features, many of which wouldn't show up in real cars for decades. The X100 looked like a futuristic cruiser with smooth lines, a panoramic windshield, and plenty of chrome. But the real fun was inside. Ford filled it with every gadget imaginable. Power seats that swiveled, a telephone, a television, and even a built-in electric shaver. That's right. You could groom on the go. There was also a refrigeration unit for drinks, a dictation machine, and safety innovations like crash padding that predicted modern airbags. The driver's seat was designed almost like a cockpit, with dials, switches, and controls for everything. While most of it was gimmicky, some ideas were shockingly forward-thinking. Heated seats, automatic climate control, and even radar-based collision detection systems were dreamed up for this car. In 1953, that was downright wild. Of course, the X100 wasn't practical for production. It was expensive, heavy, and complicated. But as a rolling lab, it showed the direction Ford believed the industry would take. They weren't wrong. Many of the crazy features eventually became standard decades later. So was the X100 weird? Absolutely. It was basically a test kitchen on wheels, with ideas ranging from clever to completely over the top. But it also gave us a glimpse at a future where cars weren't just machines, they were tech-packed lifestyle hubs. Lincoln Futura, 1955. Sometimes a weird car becomes a legend, and that's exactly what happened with the Lincoln Futura. Built in 1955 as a futuristic concept under Ford's Lincoln brand, the Futura was a double-bubble dream machine. It had twin canopies, massive fins, and a body that looked like it was sculpted by wind tunnels from another planet. The car was hand-built by Ghia in Italy at enormous cost, rumored to be around $250,000, a staggering figure for the time. Its push-button controls and flashy styling made it the star of auto shows, where crowds swarmed just to stare at its sci-fi profile. Painted a pearlescent white with subtle blue highlights, it shimmered under the lights like something from outer space. The Futura's big claim to fame came later. In the mid-1960s, TV producer George Barris needed a futuristic car for a new superhero show. He bought the mothballed Futura for $1 and transformed it into one of the most famous cars in the world, the Batmobile from the 1966 Batman series. With black paint, red pinstriping, and gadgets galore, the Futura's second life turned it into pop culture royalty. It's easy to forget just how weird the original car was before its caped Crusader makeover. The twin domes trapped heat like a greenhouse. The body was almost impossible to mass produce, and it drove more like a parade float than a daily car. But none of that mattered. It was built to stun, and it did exactly that. From high-concept dream machine to TV legend, the Lincoln Futura is proof that even the weirdest experiments can end up immortal. All it took was a superhero costume to cement its place in history. Ford Comuta, 1967. If you think electric cars are a new obsession, think again. Back in 1967, Ford built the Comuta, a pint-sized electric city car that looked more like a toy than a vehicle. Developed in the UK, the Comuta was Ford's attempt to imagine what urban mobility might look like in the future, and the result was both ahead of its time and undeniably weird. The Comuta was tiny, barely longer than a golf cart, and could seat 2 adults plus 2 children in the back. Its boxy shape was all function, no flair, but inside it was surprisingly practical. Powered by 4 12-volt lead-acid batteries, it could reach about 40 miles per hour and travel up to 40 miles on a charge, if you drove gently. Those numbers sound modest today, but in the 1960s, it was revolutionary. Ford wasn't chasing performance here. The idea was to create a safe, cheap, zero-emission commuter car for crowded cities. The Comuta even had regenerative braking, a feature that wouldn't become mainstream for decades. It was also whisper quiet, a trait that unnerved some drivers who were used to roaring engines. So why didn't it succeed? Simple. Batteries back then were heavy, expensive, and limited. Ford only built a handful of Comutas, and the project was shelved as gas stayed cheap and small electrics seemed unnecessary. Looking back, the Comuta feels like a preview of our modern EV revolution. It was weird in its simplicity, almost cartoonish in appearance, yet it carried seeds of the future. Today, tiny EVs are a thing in Europe and Asia, But Ford had already tested the waters nearly 60 years ago. Ford GT90 1995. By the 1990s, Ford wasn't content with just making family sedans. They wanted to remind the world they could build a supercar. Enter the GT90, unveiled in 1995, and still one of the wildest one-offs the company ever produced. With its razor-sharp wedge styling, glowing white paint, and absurd engine, the GT90 looked like it had time-traveled straight from the future. Under the hood sat a quad-turbocharged V12 engine, pumping out an estimated 720 horsepower. That's insane even today, but in the mid-90s it was unheard of from a company better known for Tauruses and Escorts. The car's top speed was claimed at over 230 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest concepts of its day. The body was all angles and aggression, built with carbon fiber and aluminum honeycomb panels. It also borrowed heat-resistant ceramic tiles from the Space Shuttle program to keep the exhaust from melting the car itself. This wasn't just futuristic, it was borderline absurd. Inside, the GT90 kept the science fiction theme going with minimalist digital displays and a cockpit-style layout. It was never meant for production, but it did serve as a statement. Ford could play in the exotic supercar sandbox, too. The GT90 influenced later Ford GT designs, though none matched its sheer lunacy. What made it weird wasn't just its looks or power, but the fact that Ford, king of pickup trucks and practical sedans, suddenly unleashed a hypercar rivaling Italian exotics. It was out of character, bold, and unforgettable. The GT90 may have been a one-off, but it lives on as one of Ford's most outrageous stunts. It wasn't just a car. It was a flex, showing the world that Detroit could still dream, and dream big. Ford Synus, 2005. Imagine a car that doubles as a bank vault. That was the thinking behind the Ford Synus, unveiled in 2005. At first glance, this concept looked like someone had welded armor plates onto a compact hatchback. Its design screamed, "Don't mess with me." And that was exactly the point. The Synus was marketed as a car for the urban warrior, a response to rising concerns about safety and city living. The name even hinted at its dual personality. Syn for synthesis and US for United States. Its exterior had blocky lines, thick doors, and a front grille that looked like it could survive a zombie apocalypse. The most bizarre feature? Its windows and windshield had steel shutters that could roll down and completely block the outside world. Locked up, the car transformed into a sealed pod, like a mini panic room on wheels. The interior was equally strange. Instead of focusing on driving, it had a lounge-like setup with swivel seats and a giant flat-screen television. Ford even suggested the Synus could serve as a mobile entertainment pod when parked. It wasn't meant for production, but it was a glimpse into Ford's attempt to reimagine cars as lifestyle bubbles. Instead of just moving you from A to B, the Synus was meant to make you feel safe and entertained, like a bunker meets living room. Was it practical? Not at all. Was it weird? Without question. It remains one of Ford's most polarizing concepts, proof that sometimes the company was willing to lean fully into paranoia and futurism at the same time. Ford 021C 1999. By the late 1990s, Ford wanted to shake up its image, so it turned to Mark Newson, a world-famous industrial designer, and asked him to create a concept car with no rules. The result was the Ford 021C, unveiled in 1999, and it looked like a pastel-colored toy that had rolled straight out of an art gallery. The 21C was a boxy little sedan with flat panels, smooth edges, and a minimalist vibe. Painted in soft pastels and fitted with neon lights, it felt more like a fashion accessory than a car. The headlights were flat squares, the interior was stripped down, and the dashboard was a lesson in simplicity. Even the seats could rotate and slide out for easy access. One of its quirkiest touches was the storage. Instead of a traditional glove box, the car had pull-out drawers. It also had rear-hinge suicide doors that opened backward for dramatic effect. Inside, the design focused less on performance and more on fun, youth, and lifestyle. Critics were divided. Some praised it as a bold reimagining of car design, while others mocked it for looking like a Fisher-Price toy. But Ford wasn't aiming for mass appeal, it wanted to make a statement. The 21C wasn't about horsepower or practicality. It was about showing that cars could be art, could be playful, and could dare to be different. Today, it stands as one of the strangest cars Ford ever built, not because it was over-the-top futuristic, but because it was unapologetically minimalist. In a world of excess, Ford tried to sell simplicity, and that, in its own way, was weirdly radical. Ford Probe 5, 1985. In 1985, Ford's designers decided to chase air itself. The result was the Ford Probe 5, a concept car so slippery that it made most airplanes look clunky. Built by Ford of Europe and Ghia, the Probe 5 was designed to push the limits of aerodynamics, and it delivered with a drag coefficient of just 0.137. For context, that's lower than many jets, and still astonishing even today. The car looked like a teardrop on wheels. Its body was long and low, with covered rear wheels, flush surfaces, and almost no sharp edges. The headlights were thin slits, the roofline was glassy and smooth, and the rear tapered to a sharp point. It looked less like a car, and more like something that should be tested in NASA's wind tunnel. Inside, the Probe 5 matched its futuristic exterior with digital displays and high-tech controls. Even the doors were wild. They slid backward instead of swinging out, giving the car a space-age feel. The seating was compact, the layout was unusual, and everything felt like a science experiment. The goal wasn't to build a production vehicle. Instead, Ford used the Probe 5 to learn how far it could push design to save fuel. Many of its lessons trickled down into future models, especially during the fuel-conscious 1980s, when aerodynamics suddenly mattered a lot. But let's be honest, the car's appearance was bizarre. With its ultra-smooth body and pointy tail, it looked like a futuristic pod dropped into the wrong decade. People admired its engineering brilliance, but few could picture themselves actually driving one. In the end, the Probe 5 proved one thing. Weird doesn't always mean impractical. Sometimes weird is just ahead of its time. So there you have it, 13 of the strangest rides Ford ever dared to imagine. From nuclear-powered family cars to toy-like fashion statements, these machines prove one thing. Ford wasn't afraid to get weird. Some ideas were brilliant, others laughable, but all of them pushed the boundaries of what a car could be. Which one shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts below, hit subscribe, and let's keep exploring the wild side of automotive history.